All right. Well, first of all, welcome. Thank you. We are very excited we know you had lots of choices for this session, and so we're excited to have you here. My name is Dr. Julie Stewart. I am an associate professor in the business department at CC Aurora. I am also an adjunct faculty in the business department at CC Denver. Um, I had a prior life in finance and healthcare. So I got into higher ed because I love teaching. So we'd like to welcome you. Jasmine, do you want to do a brief intro before we get to that other intro slide?
An intro to the intro. That sounds so meta. Sure, yeah, definitely. Hi, I'm Dr. Jasmine Yap. I am the Inclusive Pedagogy Instructional Coach for Community College of Aurora. So I work under the Title V grant, and I'm currently working with Julie and the business department on making our courses more inclusive and equitable and culturally responsive. So very excited to be here. My prior life was first as a research scientist. So I did my postdoc at CU Boulder in the Institute for Behavioral Genetics, and then also was an adjunct at DU, and then decided, hey, I really like this teaching thing. So I actually stopped working for a little bit, went into an education program, did a master's in education, and started teaching high school science. So chemistry, biology, human anatomy and physiology, and earth science. So that was my last point of classroom time until I got to CCA. And now I'm here working with faculty and instructors, and it's been a great journey.
Thank you, Jasmine. Again, welcome to all of you. We are going to be talking about strategies to implement equitable pedagogy in both your business and science classrooms. I think sometimes there are some sciences that feel like equitable pedagogy is more easily incorporated into their content and curriculum. And some of the feedback that we've gotten is, okay, how do we do this in some of the harder sciences? How do we do this in math and science and business? And so we felt like there might have been a bit of a gap in that content. So we're here to try and share what we've learned and experienced. So our second intro of intros, the pictures on the left, my son is a motocross racer. And so that's me trying not to shiver while we're at the motocross race. And then we live on a ranch on the plains of Eastern Colorado. And so that's just a picture of one of our horses. So again, super excited that you're here. Hope we can share some great information and some takeaways that you'll be able to use in your courses going forward. So Jasmine, how about your second introduction?
The more personal introduction. So
Right.
the top right corner, I actually have cursor control. Is me on my very first day of school. That's me on the first day of pre-kindergarten. I was born and raised in the New York City area. So I was in Jersey City. I'm the daughter of immigrants from the Philippines. And yeah, I think like on the bottom, you see my family. That's my husband, Brian, and then our two kids, Carrie and Julian, and just a little bit about them. Carrie and Julian are actually a sibling pair from foster care that came to us a few years ago, and we recently adopted them a couple of years ago. They have invisible disabilities and also are of Latinx descent. So a lot of this equity work I do for them and their futures, and it's pretty personal work for me. All right, so we do have a bit of an icebreaker because we did say in our description that this would be interactive. So the first icebreaker is to think of your favorite teacher from any phase of life. Why is this person your favorite? What were they like? What was their class like? And just take about 60 seconds to think about it. And then you can type your response on our Padlet. So I'll put in the chat our Padlet link. All right, so Padlet link is in the chat. So give it a think and then just put your response there. All right, we're starting to get responses. Good. Good to see that the Padlet is still working. Now I'll switch screens so we can all see what we're saying here. So just keep going. I believe there are about 20 of us here, so, you know, I'm using my teacher stance there. All right, so as we put our responses in and also look at other people's responses, what are some common, I guess, themes or characteristics we see? And these answers can be put in our chat. All right, we have some responses in the chat now. Engaging, compassionate, fun and authentic.
I think empathy is showing up in a number of those posts as well.
Supportive. I also see in the Padlet, honest and transparent, push me to reach my potential. All right, good. So those are things we hope to be for our students, right? When we think of the things we do in the classroom, we hope that we are engaging and supportive, passionate, compassionate, you know, those things. Respectful, challenging, with support. Absolutely. Okay, I have a second icebreaker now. Think of a time you were in a class where you didn't fully understand what was being taught or didn't feel like fully engaging in class. What were the circumstances? Why do you think you couldn't understand or fully engage? And how did it make you feel? So I will put the second Padlet link in the chat. Just have to find it. All right, so the second link is up. So hopefully this is a universal experience where you've been in a position where you didn't quite understand what was going on or just didn't feel like engaging. All right, and as responses are coming in.
Do you want to put that Padlet up?
Yeah, I will.
Okay.
So while they're coming in, I want you to now, you know, think about kind of the same thing as with number one that we did. What are the shared themes or ideas that you noticed? So I'm going to switch screens now so that we all can see what I'm seeing. So I'll start from the top here. Mind wandering, I was bored, I felt unseen, condescending instructor, thick accent, was not engaging, I was not interested in the topic, incredibly frustrated, having ADHD with a topic that was challenging, an audio lecture format, content didn't offer application to the real world, science was mysterious to me, I needed more examples or reasons why I should do the work, college physics. I had lost my brother and was grieving. My brain wasn't working. I was frustrated in an online accounting class where the homework caused unnecessary labor, had to navigate racist experiences within the classroom, too much sarcasm and favorites in class. The way the information was delivered was above my head. So yeah, what are some like shared themes you're seeing? And you can put that in our chat. Things that stuck out to me are being frustrated, not having any real world relevance, and then not being accessible if you do have an impairment.
Yeah, and I think
And not engaging.
Eric's talking about not engaging didn't work with students understanding. So understanding that there are different starting points for our students.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for engaging in our two activities here. I will go back to the main presentation. All right, so a little bit about the work we're doing here at CCA. So CCA is a Hispanic serving institution, and we recently received Title V grant funding. And so one of the goals of the grant is to institutionalize culturally responsive pedagogy and equitable teaching practices. So starting with select departments. So we have worked with English, science, and now we're also working with business and their gateway courses. And then Julie and I are working together to begin redesigning the Business 115 course curriculum to be more inclusive of student identities and cultures, and to improve success rates and persistence for our students of color and first generation college students. And so, so the things we are going to be talking about today, or the standards we'll be using in today's workshop, are from the Center for Research on Education, Diversity, and Excellence, so CREED. And CREED funded 31 research projects around the US between 1996 and 2001. And researchers gathered data and tested various curriculum models in wide-ranging settings with diverse student populations. So from classrooms with predominantly Zuni-speaking students in New Mexico, to urban schools in Florida, to California elementary schools with large populations of native Spanish-speaking students. And out of that work came 5 key standards that CREED deemed as effective for pedagogy and school reform. And those are the ones we'll be talking about today. And these standards can be used from K to 20, basically to adult learning. And then here's CREED's philosophy. So the ethos behind CREED's work is that all students can learn. Students learn best when challenged by high standards. So when we talk about scaffolding, I think in education, sometimes there's this gut reaction to think that we are lowering standards, whereas we really want to make sure that we are helping students reach those high standards and and removing barriers to doing so. English proficiency is an attainable goal for all students, and bilingual or multilingual proficiency is desirable for all students. So we don't want our students to have to like disregard or like put away their primary language or languages. And we do want to value those. So the work we do is not to like replace whatever their primary language is with English, but to rather have English proficiency in conjunction with their primary languages. Language and cultural diversity can be assets for teaching and learning. So again, using that as an advantage in teaching rather than using a deficit mindset, something that was talked about in the keynote, like having more of an equity mindedness framework when you're working with your students. Teaching and learning must accommodate individuals. So like when we looked at the Padlet, what really kind of struck me was the person who put the story or the point about having ADHD and not being accommodated. And it doesn't go with just, I think, impairments or disabilities, but it could be with learning English language or um, social emotional issues they may be experiencing outside of your classroom. Schools can mitigate risk factors by teaching social and learning skills. And finally, solutions to risk factors must be grounded in a valid general theory of developmental, teaching, and schooling processes. So these are the 5 standards, and we'll share a link with the standards, the rubric, and all of that later in an activity we'll be doing. But just briefly, the 5 standards are: first, joint productive activity. So having some sort of activity where teachers and students are producing together. So this ties into Vygotsky's social constructivist theories of learning, where students can learn best when they learn in their zone of proximal development, and they use their peers or the instructor to help them keep learning and move to a higher level. And then there's language development. So especially I think across all of the disciplines in higher ed, part of it is learning language and literacy in that discipline, right? Learning the vocabulary, the lingo, how to write and communicate in that specific field. Contextualization, so making meaning, connecting school to students' lives. So when we are teaching, are we using our own lens to teach? Or are we allowing students to learn from their own cultural lens? And so we'll talk a little bit about some examples later on that allow students to contextualize from their own cultural lens and framework, and truly values what students bring into the classroom, their funds of knowledge and their community cultural wealth. Challenging activities. So part of our job is to teach those critical thinking skills and higher level complex thinking skills. And then finally, instructional conversation. So rather than like me speaking the whole time, am I the only one speaking? There's an old saying in like K-12 that whoever does the speaking, whoever does the talking does the learning. So if I'm doing all the talking, I'm doing all the learning, right? So the idea is to start having, break the socialization to silence in the classroom and having students do the talking. Yeah,
All
pass to
right.
Julie.
Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you. So what I'd like you to do is just put a phrase or a word in the chat box when you think about traditional learning in higher education. What are some of the words or the emotions that come to mind when you think of traditional learning in higher education? Scholar, passive, very passive. Yeah. Ivory tower. That's a great one. Old school. Yeah. High anxiety testing. Yes. Lecture. Yeah, absolutely. I think all of those really touch on what we're trying to move away from, because we need to really understand control. Absolutely. Thank you. We're really trying to move away from being the sage on the stage, right? We are lecturing, we are all knowing, we have everything, and we need to share this out. We have to get it down the throats of our students. And I think, again, thank you, Leilanda, for rigid. I think there's a rigidity to traditional learning paradigms that exist. And when we think about that, we think about the instructor bearing the brunt of that cognitive load. We have a responsibility that we have to know it all. We have to share it all. There isn't room for collaboration. There isn't room for students to share their own perspectives and knowledge and experiences. And so it comes from a realm of centered in that whiteness, or centered in that traditional view that education was really founded upon. In this traditional learning style, students take notes and absorb the information, and then they have to spit it back out. That's, that is very traditional. When we look at from the perspective of business, um, we really work in a collaborative kind of environment. So when we're looking at shifting the way that we're teaching business and science, it really is collaborative when we're not in the classroom. And so we need to look at ways that we can possibly shift the way that we're delivering that. And so here's an example, a traditional lecture, if you will, about the differences between three different styles of business design. Okay, so we're looking at corporations, LLCs, and sole proprietorships. This is a nice little graph for us. In a traditional setting, we would go ahead and put this graphic up on the board, and students would begin memorizing, whether that means making note cards, or just sitting there staring at the page. There isn't a way to interact with that. It's just an expectation that they will rotely memorize and then share that back out with us in a high stakes testing kind of environment. The power rules there are significant because I have the knowledge and they are required to learn that. So there's really no contextualization of the content. So now if we look at this creed, the 5 creed standards, I have an activity when I teach about these 3 different kinds of sole proprietorships, partnerships, and corporations. It's a marshmallow activity. And so what I do is I have individual baggies. Now this was in a face-to-face environment, but I had individual baggies that had 10 marshmallows and 25 toothpicks. Everyone in the room got one baggie of toothpicks and marshmallows. Then we went through and out of a hat, they drew a 1, 2, or a 3. So ones were sole proprietorships, twos were partnerships, and threes were corporations. The goal of this was to really interact with and be able to have a discussion about what the differences, pros and cons were with each of these different kinds of business organizations. So the sole proprietors had to work by themselves, the partnerships got to work together in pairs, and then the corporations were the remainder of the class that didn't draw a 1 or a 2. Okay, and so the goal was to build the highest structure. And so as they went through and did this, they were able to really look at and examine the pros of a sole proprietorship were, they had the right to make their own decisions. They could decide how they wanted to design it. Whereas in the corporation, as we were going through the process, that group got a little more animated because everybody had their own ideas about how they wanted that activity or how they wanted that structure to be built. And so we were able to have some small group discussion within each of those different organizational types about what worked and what didn't. And then we brought that all back together as a class and talked about the pros and cons of each of those business designs. This was really used as a scaffolding project. And so we'll talk about that, how that was used a little bit later on in the presentation. But it was a great way for students who were architecturally inclined. It was a great activity because students were having to talk about how do we design this and what were the pros and cons. And so there was lots of language activity happening with this. There was lots of co-creation happening with this. And so this was an interesting way to look at that without having to memorize it from that wonderful black and white graphic that we had to start off with. So with this, there was also, if you could go to the next slide for me, Jasmine. Thanks. So that was part 1. So then when we did that, we used that as sort of a scaffolding project. The final cumulative project for this particular intro course, they had to develop a business plan. And so there was some conversation and some group discussion about how did that marshmallow activity help you decide which organizational design you wanted to use. What was the personal connection to the organization that you're designing the business plan for? So really drawing student interest into why are they interested in that organization? How did this activity help them decide which design they wanted to use? What expertise do you have to build on your organization? So again, really asking students, what am I good at? What are my strengths? And then finally, what expertise do others in the class have that you could network with to further develop your plan? So again, understanding the importance of building that network in a business environment, because there are lots of different resources. There are subject matter experts everywhere, whether it's in the classroom or whether it's in an organization. And so we got to practice a lot of contextualizing, a lot of students bringing their own strengths, and we had some great conversations about, you know what, I'm really great at marketing. And so then, as students were developing their business plans, they started to network with other students. And I had one student who was so amazing at the artwork piece of network of marketing that everybody was asking her to help with that. And so it really helped to create a community built on that scaffolding that the Creed design really looks at. And so I'm going to have Jasmine share a science example of how some Creed design was influenced.
Sure, thank you. So kind of similar to Dr. Stewart's example, you have, so this would be a typical slide, right? And it would be a lecture where slides move very quickly and students are rapidly, probably breaking out in a sweat, copying their notes down and trying to write every single word you put on a slide. And so sometimes I think it's useful, especially if you're prioritizing what should be learned or what the learning targets are for a particular lesson. And in this case, my learning target is students will be able to describe how the cell membrane works, basically. And so here you have the slide and you have the picture of the cell membrane, the phospholipid bilayer, and then how it works. You have some little bullet points, and then students are copying the notes down. We're expecting them to, spend the time just writing the notes rather than actually sitting and processing that information. At least that was my experience as an undergrad, especially taking Gen Bio in a lecture hall of 100 students. And then make sure you have this memorized by the time of the exam. So with Creed, again, we have our 5 standards. The first one being joint productive activity. So if this is a really important standard or learning target for me, I'm going to pause in lecture and actually incorporate this joint productive activity where I will ask, so I'll use the same slide, but instead I'll have a prompt. So maybe I'll break up students in groups of 3 or 4. And you can still do this online with breakout rooms and have them to discuss the following prompt. So here's the prompt. A single eukaryotic cell is like the United States of America, and the cell membrane is like the US borders. How is the cell membrane like the US borders? Use the terms. So here we're working on language and literacy development. Use the term selective permeability, passive transport, and active transport. Specify what the phospholipids, embedded proteins, and cholesterol are in your analogy. So people are working in groups. They're allowed to contextualize from their own cultural and experiential lens to create their own, make meaning from what was just taught or shared, right? So they're using their own lens to say, for example, a single eukaryotic cell and the cell membrane is like a volleyball game. Actually, that was somebody's example. And yes, you can get lots of answers, and here's the scaffolding part. If something doesn't fit quite right, I always have the student explain, oh, what do you mean by that when you say, for example, the referee is the whatever, I don't know, one of the structures. And so like, if that's not quite right, then we scaffold that and we talk about it. And so through that, students are still getting, the practice. And this is tying to social constructivist theories of learning, where you use the help of your peers to learn. And also the instructor as well as helping with guiding and scaffolding. So after this prompt, and they come up, groups come up with their own analogies, then we hand off for individual work. Now that, I've given my, we've worked through our own example as a whole group, students work on their own analogies. Here you ask an individual to do it on their own. And so hopefully by the time you go from I do, we do, and then now you do, the student is ready to start using those vocabulary terms on their own and explain from their own perspective, using an analogy different from the one they created with their group. Again, you're using instructional conversation, a challenging activity, contextualization, language and literacy development, and then it's jointly produced. So it's co-generated or co-created. So here is the rubric. I'm just going to share the rubric in the chat, and then I'll let Julie talk a little bit. Let me find the rubric. All right, so I have in the chat 2 links. One is to a full rubric, so it goes from like not showing the standard at all in your lesson to enacting, I think. And then the next link includes this, what you see in the slide, which is a 6th standard. So I think in equity work, part of our work is connected to social justice education. So being able to teach to transform inequities. So that's a 6th standard. It's not officially part of the 5 CREED standards, but it's something new that has been added recently. Oh, you're muted.
See, we've been doing this for over a year, and one would think we would just all be so aware of that. I'm sorry, my apologies. Thank you, Jasmine. What we're going to do, we're going to go into some breakout rooms. And I want you to think about using that CREED rubric, using those 5 standards. The ideal goal is to incorporate that 6th one that Jasmine just talked about. Go into these breakout rooms, and I want you to creedify one of the lessons that the lesson activities that you bring with you. Okay, incorporate all 5, try to add the 6th, and then we have a Microsoft form. Jasmine just added that in the link as well. So please submit your lesson via that Microsoft form. And then when we come back together, we're going to have you share out how you did that and do a brief debrief with us. So we want to hear about the activity or lesson that you came up with. So can we go into breakout rooms?
How many people would you want in each room?
If we did 3 or 4.
3 or 4. Okay, I think everyone should have gotten a room.
All right, welcome back, everyone. So hopefully that was some productive time with your breakout room to kind of just start talking about and thinking about how to add more of these standards into your teaching. So just as a close, one thing I like to do in my classrooms is do a quick whip around. And since there are a good number of us, we'll just do it via chat. So please type in the chat one word to describe something you learned today or how you feel after this session on CREED standards. So we have contextualizing learning, curious, alternatives, confident, useful tools, making meaning, excited, deeper interactions, interesting. So feel free to keep adding, but we are beyond time, I know, by about 4 minutes. So thank you for your engagement and participation. I will put in the chat now, like basically it's a Google Doc with some resources that I use when I do our design work, and also when I do stuff with CREED. So the first one is a book written by some of the folks at CREED, Teaching Transformed. So that's a really good resource. If you can get a copy of it, I highly recommend it. And then all the other ones are great as well. The CREED website itself is very useful. To even have a whole like tab full of video examples if you're kind of stuck on what a particular standard